Hello mamas and welcome back to the Pregnancy with Physio Laura podcast. Today we are diving into episode 3 of 5 in this C-section birth series, sharing my first birth story with you all. Now I'm sharing the interview I did with Sophie Walker from the Australian Birth Stories podcast, which was recorded a few weeks after my second baby was born. Don't forget, we've already released the first 2 episodes on mental preparation and processing for a C-section birth, as well as physical recovery after a C-section birth. So make sure you go and check those out before diving into today's episode. Now, the reason I wanted to use this interview on Australian birth stories rather than to re-record my birth stories is that our story changes with time. So as we learn more about ourselves, our past, or as our life experience changes, so too can our past stories. And I didn't want to change the story to suit today's Laura, as I felt it was rawer to share it from an earlier time. I was only a few weeks post my second C-section when I recorded that interview with Sophie, and truthfully, I hadn't listened to it again until I started planning this podcast series, which is a year and a half later. And it was really interesting to go back and hear a past version of Laura talk about what happened, and 95% of the story would continue to be told the same way if I were to re-record it today. The only things I feel I have a different lens or perspective on now is how I would have managed the late stage of my pregnancy and heading into my labour. Now, I don't want to dive too much into this now, as the purpose of this podcast is to just share my story and hope that it resonates with some people or helps other people feel, more positively about their births. But in hindsight and reflection, I probably wouldn't have agreed to be induced before my due date for the reasons that I was. And I also would have chosen to go home and wait after the induction didn't work rather than to have a C-section. However, in saying that, they are the choices I would have made today. They are not the choices that I would have made 3 years ago when this birth first took place. Now, I don't have any regrets from my birth. In fact, I actually have quite positive feelings and experiences towards them, which I'm very grateful to have had, because I feel like my first 2 births have been exactly what I needed. They have taught me the exact lessons that I needed to learn, and they have put me in the position I am in today. So whilst I say I would go back and change these things, I really wouldn't, because I needed all these experiences to be where I am at right now. But I certainly have learnt from them, and that is how I would change those situations if I were to be in the same position today. So I hope that makes sense. As I record this episode, I am over halfway through my 3rd pregnancy, and I'm excited to share this journey and the upcoming birth with you all afterwards. And it's so great to be able to share my learnings and experiences from each birth journey so far. Now, for today's Laura's life lessons, I thought this one would tie in really well with what I just mentioned about my learnings from my first birth story. So to use a quote I love, there is no such thing as failure, only learning experiences. So I personally truly don't believe that anything in life is a failure. I believe it is either a lesson that you needed to learn or a redirection from life that needed to go a different way. So I hope that if you are feeling like you've failed something in life, instead look at it like you've just learned an incredible lesson about the world, about yourself, about your environment, whatever it might be. Now, let's get into episode 3 of our 5-part C-section birth series, chatting about my first pregnancy and birth story.
In today's episode of the show, I interview Laura, and Laura takes us through her 2 pregnancies and births. She had an emergency cesarean in her first, and she attempted a VBAC with her second, and I'll let you know how that went in today's episode. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today, Laura. It's lovely to have you on.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be chatting to you.
It's funny. It's like we're pen friends. We've been talking for years, and nice to finally chat in real virtual life.
Yeah, it is.
Do you want to explain a little bit about yourself to the listeners, where you're living and who's in your family and what you do for work?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Laura, and I live on the Surf Coast in Victoria, and I live with my husband J.A. and my son Mussy, who is 20 months now, and my daughter Pia, who is 3 weeks old. She's wrapped up on my chest right now. Hopefully not going to be too noisy during this podcast. We'll see how we go. But I'm a women's health physio, so I work mostly with pregnant and postnatal women, and I work in Geelong at a clinic, and I also run an online pregnancy program, the Pregnancy Posse. So that keeps me nice and busy.
Yeah, definitely. And we've been shouting out to the Pregnancy Posse lately lately, so people can check that out, but we'll put all the links in the show notes, and you can perhaps expand a little bit more on that throughout, because I know you were practicing what you preach basically throughout your second one.
Absolutely, yes. I've had some lovely women from ABS join the posse as well, which has been really nice. So
awesome.
Yeah, it's been good.
Do you want to just take us through your first pregnancy then? Did you plan to conceive when you did?
Yeah, so we did. We had been talking about having children for maybe like 6 months leading up to it, and it was always that, when's the right time? And I kept saying, but I want to do this with my business, or go on a big Italy trip beforehand. And I think you think the world's going to end when you have a baby. So I had this big bucket list, and then I sort of woke up one day and I went, why am I trying to tickle these things off? Because I'm always trying to rush it so that I can have a baby. Let's just have a baby. Like, why do I need to have done all these things beforehand? And so we went, okay, let's do it. And fortunately, we fell pregnant quite quickly. And I didn't know any different. And I had been tracking my cycle for probably about 6 months before we started trying. So I was pretty confident in knowing when to try to conceive and all of that. But unfortunately, we had 2 miscarriages to start with, which is not what I expected, and sort of not what you're prepared for when you're young and fit and healthy and don't really know of anyone else who's had that before. So that was a little bit of a hiccup, but it's funny how in hindsight it all feels like it worked out how it was meant to be. And I had a really good obstetrician who was very reassuring and comforting, and yeah, we were very lucky. So despite having that little hiccup at the start of it, we were able to conceive Mussy just a couple of months after our second miscarriage. And whilst, we were quite anxious and we didn't really celebrate probably for the first 12 weeks because you're always on tenterhooks about how things are going to go, but after that 12-week ultrasound, we could relax a little bit more, and it was very exciting. So that's how we conceived Mussy, and touch wood, the rest was all very, very smooth sailing. So yeah, I can't complain at all.
Did you just sort of treat yourself throughout your pregnancy with exercise and things like that, or did you see another physio for a kind of more objective opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of people ask me if the physio has a physio, but I was fortunate in that I didn't really have too many troubles. So I had a little bit of SIJ, or back pain, pelvic pain, towards the end of my pregnancy, and I did get a couple of treatments with a colleague just to help me manage that a little bit better, and I occasionally got taped up from a colleague. It was never anything super official. It was like, I'm a bit niggly today, someone's got a free appointment, I'll just slot in there and get some treatment. But I mostly managed myself because I knew what to avoid if I had pain and how to pull back and modify. And I'm just trying to think, because it all blurs into one, but the pregnancy posse, no, I didn't have the pregnancy posse when I was pregnant with Mussy, so I didn't have my workouts to follow, but I was doing my own sort of routine at home and keeping fit in the ways I felt comfortable. Just the occasional physio appointment with a colleague, so that was really handy.
And did you continue on with, you mentioned you had an obstetrician, did you continue on under sort of private care with them?
Yeah, so before I fell pregnant, I had started looking up. I had always thought I would want to go privately because I really liked the idea of the continuity of care and having the same person seeing you every single time. And I really knew I wanted that would work for me. And after having the miscarriage, so I hadn't actually seen my obstetrician for a pregnancy checkup yet. So the first time I saw him was because I was having a miscarriage and we wanted to check to see if I needed a D&C or anything. And just the way he handled that really cemented to me that this was going to be the guy I would see for all of my pregnancies. And he was really, really good at how he handled it. He made my husband and I feel so comfortable and reassured. And so, yeah, I was sold on him for the pregnancy. I wasn't second guessing that at all. So we went back to him for the pregnancy as well. So, and I'd found him because a client of mine, I was sort of sussing out my patients when I was thinking about conceiving. I was asking them, how'd you find your experience? Who did you see? Blah, blah, blah. I was getting a bit of a, testimonials. And this one lady, I don't know why it stood out to me, but she mentioned she had this obstetrician, and just the way she was describing him, I thought he seems like someone I'd get on with really well, and that's how I picked him through a patient recommendation.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah.
So I've come across, in my time seeing women's health physios, I've come across two physios that were pre-babies, but were both adamant that they wanted cesareans because they're like, no, we've seen the other end of things because they're treating sort of prolapses and traumas and things. Did all your experience working with women postnatally, did that sort of shape what you wanted for your birth or what you didn't want?
Great question, because I definitely think there are some physios who are a bit nervous about it, because, you can't help but think that what you're seeing is how everyone is. And I know anyone in the healthcare industry is the same. I know women who work with infants in special care are really concerned that their babies are going to have issues and whatnot. And, being a women's health physio, you're only dealing with women who have problems after birth and need your help. So you start to get a bit of a bias that you think everyone who's had a vaginal delivery is going to need help, and it's definitely not the case. We're only seeing the minority of women with prolapse and incontinence and things like that. But I certainly had it in the back of my mind, and I think it made me really determined to do everything I could to prepare for birth well. But I never walked into pregnancy and birth thinking, oh, I'm definitely having a cesarean. I do not want to do any damage to my pelvic floor. I was quite the opposite. I was like, oh, if I could birth in a rainforest, I would do it, and as natural as can be. And I've always been a bit of a birth junkie, and I loved watching YouTube clips and docos on birth. And so I think I'm a little bit unusual in that whilst I had that knowledge of what could potentially, go wrong or what could happen to your pelvic floor, I certainly was still very keen on natural birth and, as little intervention as possible. And like I said, birthing in a rainforest, and I have all these grand dreams, and it certainly didn't turn out that way. But, I wasn't scared by it.
Yeah, awesome. And did you have many pregnancy symptoms other than the sort of bit of niggling lower back pain? Were you very nauseous or anything with your first?
I was really lucky in that I just felt a little bit seedy. I wasn't really vomiting very much, but I just felt always a bit groggy and a bit nauseous. But that was absolutely fixed by having hash browns, which was terrible. I remember I would start in the clinic at 7 a.m. and I would go past McDonald's at 6:30 and get my 2 hash browns, and I'd turn up to the clinic and I'd had my hash browns for breakfast and I was feeling great. And it probably didn't help with weight gain and other things during pregnancy, but it certainly kept the nausea at bay. But I was very lucky. Some family members and friends have had terrible nausea during their pregnancy and HG, and I was just one of the lucky ones, touch wood, that I didn't have hardly any of those symptoms, and I didn't have diabetes or any other complications. It was all pretty straightforward during my pregnancy. I had horrible heartburn, and I remember thinking, God, every time a client said to me they had reflux, I would go, oh yes, you poor thing, but I didn't really give them the attention I felt it desired, because after I had reflux, now every time someone tells me they do, I go, oh my God, you poor thing, that is the worst. It's just horrible. But I really can't complain. I was very lucky.
And I don't think I've seen pictures of your little boy, but I know Pia's got like a full head of hair. So maybe there's truth to that one.
Absolutely. He was, my kid's a total opposite. She was born with a thick head of black hair, and Mussy is blonde, but he was born fairly bald. So, 50-50 on that theory.
Funny. And did you do any other external birth classes, or did you just go with what your obstetrician offered at the hospital?
Yeah, so my obstetrician was big on calm birth. He was a big advocate for that. But unfortunately, when I went to book, because I was due on Australia Day, and so it was like that busy Christmas, New Year period, and everything was sold out. So I couldn't get into the calm birth course that he had recommended. So I'd been running active birth classes for a while, so I felt confident in, a lot of that was based on Juju Sundan's book, Active Birth Series, which I love and recommend to
Yeah,
everyone.
I'll put a link to that one too.
Yeah, did you read that yourself?
I did for my first, and I joked that I went a bit too hard on Juju because I was like the first twinge, I was like up and stomping, and then like 36 hours later I was exhausted. But when used correctly, I think it's great.
That's a good point to make, actually. Yeah, you got to conserve your energy when you can.
Yep.
Yeah. So I sort of relied on a lot of the knowledge I already had, but I then joined up to the She Births online course as well, because I thought it would be nice to have something extra. And I really like She Birth, have read a lot of their resources, but I was a terrible participant in that. I did sign up, but I didn't really use it very much, so I can't really comment on whether that was terribly helpful or not, because it was almost a bit too overwhelming in that final trimester, the thought of going through an entire other birth program. But I also did the hospital classes, purely out of interest, because I wanted to know what they were about, because I always had people asking me, should I do a hospital class or not? And I found that really helpful. In terms of knowing when to go to the hospital and all the things that you could be presented with at the hospital, i.e. vacuum, epidural, things like that. But I found it quite underwhelming in terms of actually equipping you with the skills to labour and birth well. And so it's good, because now if people ask me, I always recommend to do a supplementary class like a calm birth or a hypnobirth or an active birth, because I really do think you need to have a skill set, and not every tool is going to work for every woman, but breathing or active movement or fitball or mindset. Like, I think there needs to be something extra to deal with labour contractions rather than just knowing what they are. Yeah. So it was a good experience. And look, I really liked part of the birth class was the newborn component, and we had no idea, my husband and I, so we really enjoyed learning how to bath a baby and how to put a nappy on and those sorts of things. So that was really good. But I did change my tactic for baby number 2, but we can talk about that now. We can talk about that when we get there. I did a few extra things to get myself ready for birth.
Yeah. We'll hold off. We'll do that one in a minute. So how was the end stages of your pregnancy, the sort of last couple of weeks?
Yeah, it was really good, actually, because it was Christmas and New Year's, and so, the sun was out and I was swimming, and I felt really good still, apart from the reflux, so I was keeping very active. Everything was going really well. So medically, everything was perfect. My blood pressure spiked a little bit at the very end of pregnancy, but nothing major, just a little bit of a hike. And the main things we were keeping an eye on is that Mussy, we didn't know we were having a boy, but Mussy was measuring really big from about 30 weeks onwards, so just on the tape measure fundal heights. But we went and got an extra scan maybe around 34 weeks, just to see how he was measuring so we could make an informed decision. And he was measuring in like the 95th percentile at that stage, which I know can be so inaccurate. So I sort of took it with a grain of salt, but all signs were sort of pointing towards him being on the bigger side of life. And so we started having discussions around what we would do. Would we try and get him to come on out a little bit earlier, given the risks with babies who are slightly bigger, etc., which was difficult, because I think you always expect I expected first baby, your waters would break at home, you go into labour at home, and then you come to the hospital and you give birth. But being induced looked very different to that. So I remember we had like a final holiday, and I was kind of hoping that I would go into labour on my own, and one night I thought my waters had broken, but they hadn't, and I got really excited. But we had agreed to trial induction. I would have been about 38 and a half weeks. And at that stage I was measuring about 42 or 43 weeks, so I was quite big. I was getting all the, are you sure your dates are right? And are you sure you're not having twins? And all of those really pesky comments. And you don't realise how annoying they are until you are the person receiving them. But we went in, so that would have been, 38 and a half weeks. So we went in to be induced. And I really didn't know what to expect. I hadn't read up much on induction. A lot of my reading had just been around spontaneous labour. Everything I had taught had been around that. I'd never really delved into induction. So I was a little bit naive. And so we went in and we had the Prostin gel. So that was put in at night time. And the idea is that you get a dose of gel, you go for a bit of a wander, and then you come back a couple of hours later and they reassess and see how your progress is. So we went and had like a lovely dinner in Lygon Street as like a final hurrah, knowing that baby was coming very soon. And I was really confident that things were going to kick up pretty quickly because my sister-in-law had also had a similar type of induction. We did the final hurrah dinner with her, and then she had the baby at 8 a.m. the next day. And so I was like, right, okay, this baby's coming tomorrow. Like, things are really going to get moving. And then we went back to the hospital and they checked and nothing was really happening, and they said that can be quite common. So they give you some Panadol and a sleeping tablet and say, go home, have a good sleep, in anticipation that tomorrow, you know, things are going to start ramping up. And I remember driving home and I was uncomfortable, but I was fine. And I was sort of hoping to have like this restless night's sleep and be labouring at home. And I went to bed and then I woke up at 7 a.m. and I'd obviously had a brilliant sleep. And I thought, oh, okay, well, nothing's happening. I'm not going into labour. Yep. Yes. And it's funny wishing to go into discomfort. But,
yeah, it's weird.
It's a strange, very strange will. But we went back to the hospital in the morning and they check you again. And so nothing had changed, nothing was happening. And so they gave me another dose of the gel. And then it's sort of go again for a walk, get things moving, try and be upright, get gravity to work. So I remember, I look back at it in hindsight and I was like, I was not prepared at all. I had my Birkenstock sandals on and we ended up going for a 3-hour walk around the gardens and we grabbed a coffee and I was thinking, like, why am I walking in sandals? I had this awful waddle happening and I was so uncomfortable. So I was having tightenings and I didn't know what labour felt like, but turns out it wasn't productive labour anyway. So I was having tightenings, but nothing was progressing. Like as soon as I lay down in the park with JA and just had like a little, catch some sun and have a think about how everything's going to pan out and we're going to meet our baby. And then it stopped as soon as I lay down and then they'd ramp up again as I stood up. And I didn't know what to expect. So I thought we were, going to get induced and have this baby vaginally by the end of the day. And we got back to the hospital. So it'd been about, 3 hours of walking and 2 or 3 rounds of gel by then. And my OB checked me and nothing, nada. My cervix had not changed in the slightest. It was long, it was closed. There was no signs of it wanting to come along to the party just yet. So they were hoping to see, my obstetrician was saying, he doesn't see it very often when nothing happens. So it doesn't necessarily get everything happening, but sometimes the gel, or a lot of the time, the gel is enough to at least dilate women or thin their cervix enough to then be able to break your waters or do further induction techniques. But because nothing had happened to my cervix, they couldn't break my waters. There were very limited options as to what they could do to get things going, and Mussie's head was still high. Things just weren't tracking how they would expect. So then the discussion was had around having a cesarean, which was not on my radar at all. I just didn't think that that's how it would end. Or I think there was an option of like, you could go home, we can wait a couple of weeks and see if anything happens and come back in. And it's a really interesting mindset when you go in to have a baby and then you're told that you could just go home and wait, because you're like, but I came to have a baby, like I can't leave and come back in 2 weeks' time. It just seems really crazy.
How many weeks were you then? Sorry, I've forgotten.
I was 38 and a half weeks. Okay, so I could have gone longer, but it's a really interesting mindset when you've come to have a baby, and then I just don't think I even considered going home and waiting. Yeah. I think for me, look, and it is hard because I've been through a similar mental decision making a second time around, so this part's a bit hazier, but there was lots of tears, there was lots of what do we do, what's the right decision. I remember thinking that my main concern, I wasn't scared to have a cesarean, I certainly wasn't scared, but I have always thought I'd like to have 3 or 4 children, and my main concern was if I have a cesarean for my first baby, does that mean it's going to limit my options for how many children I want to have? Because, there's a general consensus that 2 or 3 Caesars is about all women should be having. And so I was really future tripping as to, like, what does this mean for the future, as opposed to what does it mean for me right now? So after a lot of discussion with my husband and my obstetrician, and I never felt pressured, I never was scared into it or anything like that. It was always my call, which is amazing, because I can't imagine being pressured into it, but it's really hard to make that decision for yourself as well. Sometimes I wish that I was just told, baby's breech and you have to have it this way, or there's a really final answer. It's really hard to try and make that call, because you're always thinking, am I making the right decision? But anyway, long story short, we decided to have the cesarean, and once I'd made the decision, I felt so much calmer about it. It was the decision making that was the hardest bit, because again, you don't know what the right decision is, and you're always thinking, but what if? And I think that's the thing with birth. What if I wait another couple of weeks, or what if I walk a little bit more, and you just don't have a magic 8 ball. So it's really hard to make a decision based on what ifs, but I'm really glad I made that decision, because I was really healthy, I was really happy, Mussy was super healthy, and so it was technically an emergency cesarean, but I walked into theatre. It wasn't being rushed in last minute and everything, crazy. So that was the decision making process of that, but it's amazing once baby comes out, you just forget about all of that. You're so focused on how incredible. I remember I was crying. I couldn't actually see him because I had so many tears in my eyes, and you can't really touch your face very well when you're on the table. So JA is dabbing my eyes and telling me we had a little Mussy. That's how he announced it. We had a boy name and a girl name, and I just cried. I cried. There were so many different reasons for that, and I think a big part of it was going, I'm about to meet my baby. There's something really surreal about sitting outside of theatre knowing that in 15 minutes you're going to have a child. And I don't have the opposite experience, but I'm not sure if in the throes of labour and birth you're thinking, I'm about to meet my baby, this is really surreal, or whether you're just caught up in the contractions. But there's something strange about feeling fairly comfortable sitting on a chair going, oh, this is happening. This is real. I'm going to be a parent. And I think a lot of the tears were about, oh wow, this is big. So that's how Mussy's birth went down. So
what was it like? Did you get to do bit of skin to skin in recovery, or how did they manage you there after he was out?
So this is the one downfall of his birth versus Pierre's birth, and I don't know if it's the same for every hospital. I don't think it is, because my mum's a midwife and she was a bit shocked that Mussy came out before me, but because it was an emergency cesarean, from a staffing point of view, they don't assign a midwife to theatre or something like that. So I actually was in recovery on my own for 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes without Mussy, and at the time I didn't probably know any different. It was a bit weird just sort of lying there going, oh, I had a son, and okay, I'm just hanging out on my own waiting to see him. I had seen him obviously in theatre. I'd had some cuddles for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then he went with JA while they sewed me up, and then you go to recovery just to check that everything's okay, and then I was upstairs with him. But that was one thing I knew going into my second pregnancy, regardless of whether it was an emergency cesarean or a scheduled C-section, I was going to make sure that baby stayed with me in recovery, because I don't know, my reasoning was, well, I think the best place for baby to be is with mum, if mum's healthy and baby's healthy. And I don't know, I don't agree with the staffing issue. I think baby's better off without a midwife and with mum than worry about if there's a midwife on staff. So I don't really agree with that policy, but at the time it didn't bother me. It was more reflecting on it. I thought, no, I really want to be with my baby. There's no reason for baby to be away from me. And so that was something I was walking into the second one with as like a request. And I thought they really can't deny you that. I think that's a real birthright if you're healthy and baby's healthy. But yeah, aside from that, the first feed went really well, so I got skin on skin as soon as I came upstairs. And that was another thing actually that I was concerned about, because you hear with cesareans that breastfeeding can be a lot harder because you're not getting the natural natural cascade of hormones, and that, you know, I know there's a lot of talk about vaginal seeding. I'm not sure if you've heard much about that, so that baby's immunity can be a little bit compromised because they're not getting the bacteria from the vaginal canal, etc., etc. So they were two of my concerns, but touch wood, we were so lucky in that breastfeeding was never a problem. So he latched really well, he fed like a champ, and immunity-wise, he's been an absolute legend. So I think the classic things that you're told about with Caesars in terms of long-term, we never really had those issues, so that was really fortunate.
Yeah, I heard Dr. Sarah Buckley talking about that one time, and she said if you miss that window of skin to skin due to a traumatic birth or due to cesarean or what have you, that you can definitely make it up. You just perhaps have to do twice as much skin on skin. So if you just ensure that as soon as you get them back, you really embrace that time and work on it, and then you can overcome it with oxytocin and things like that. But yeah.
Absolutely, and that's probably really good for women to hear, because I know that's a really big concern. And I asked before, you know, we were going to chat today, I asked some of my ladies if they had any questions, and a lot of them were around how I went with breastfeeding after a Caesar, because I think a lot of women are concerned about that. But look, I think there obviously is a little bit behind it, otherwise we wouldn't be hearing about it. But I think, like you said, you can overcome that with other strategies. So that's really good for women to know, because it's not all done, you know, it's not finished, and you can't get that time back if you don't get that initial skin to skin. So that's really good to know.
Yeah, make up the gap. And did you have a good support team in hospital with helping you sort of navigate feeding and latching and things like that?
Yeah, the midwives, I do remember, like, it's a bit hit and miss sometimes who you get. Some of them were really wonderful, and some of them, actually, I'll tell you a quick funny story. This is not to do with breastfeeding, but we play white noise when our kids are really little, and we read some things on it beforehand, and it can be quite calming. And so we brought a speaker into the hospital to play white noise to help Mussy settle. And we were doing really well in hospital. He was feeding well, settling well, all of that. And I remember in the middle of the night, one of the midwives came in and said, what's that noise? And I said, we just play white noise. It's like static noise to help him settle. And she laughed and she said, oh God, he's going to be walking down the aisle on his wedding day listening to white noise, you know, like it's such a bad habit to get into now. He'll never, you know, like be able to separate himself from it or something like that. And I was like,
and breastfeeding before he walks down the aisle too. Yeah,
that's what I said. I was like, yeah, exactly. You just have a little top up before he gets married. So I had some midwives like that, but look, for the most part, I had really fabulous midwives. And I think for me, my mum is a midwife and maternal child health nurse, and she's always been very helpful as, you know, a close family member that's also got that professional knowledge. So I remember I had a cracked nipple in the hospital, and because you don't know any different, I just thought, yeah, grin and bear it, bite on a towel, get through that first bit. But I had a midwife say to me, no, if that's sore, like, you shouldn't be screwing your face up like that. You need to get that latch better. And that was probably the best advice I ever had, because I thought it was but it's meant to be a bit sore for the first bit. And touch wood with Pia, because I knew that, I would take her off every time she wasn't latched properly and correct her latch, and I didn't get a single crack this time. And again, that's just confidence and knowledge. But I think that was a good tip the midwife gave me, because I didn't know any different. I thought, a little bit of pain, but I was biting on a towel and wincing, and
and once they're cracked, it's a bit of a trap trying to heal them, because you can't give them a break, really.
Exactly right. And I think, I don't know how women do it with bleeding nipples and cracked nipples. I only had this for maybe a week, and it was really traumatizing. I remember feeling anxious every time I had to feed on that side, and it was awful. But other than that, breastfeeding was really good. I had wonderful support. I had good milk supply, and all of that. So I always joke that back in the day, I would have been probably the wet nurse to all of the other cave women's children, because I have a really good supply, so I'm lucky.
Funny. And did you have 4 nights in hospital? How long were you in for?
So with the emergency C-section, it was 5 nights in hospital, because you get that extra night. Again, it wasn't really an emergency, but on the books it was. And being first baby, that was brilliant, because you get fed like 5 times a day, and JA could stay in the hospital with me, and it was just a really nice period to get settled. My milk had well and truly come in. We felt very comfortable to go home at the end of that. So yeah, it was nice.
So nice. And in between your kids, you developed the Pregnancy Posse. So I imagine going into your second pregnancy, you were well and truly prepared and ready to go.
Yeah, definitely. So that was, I can't even remember the timeline exactly, but I think it was launched at maybe 3 or 6 months before I fell pregnant. And yeah, it was really good because I felt like I had this real community of women around me whilst I was pregnant, and I had so much like encouragement and support. And if I had questions about, I remember I had hay fever and I didn't know what to do, and all these women would give me advice, and especially with the VBAC preparations, I had a lot of encouragement, and women were sending me resources, and it was just so wonderful to have built this community of ladies who were all really invested in each other and helping each other out, and yeah, even just to be able to follow my own workouts, little things like that was really, really helpful. But the most beautiful thing was having the community around me. It was like having the ultimate pregnancy mothers group, so that was really nice.
Yeah, they talk about having a few people have mentioned that mothers group should start before the baby's born, because it's those first kind of week or couple of weeks that you really need to ask random questions to people. So it's beautiful to start, to go into the pregnancy and pre-birth and have them ready to go.
That is so true.
You moderate that group yourself too, so there's not just like crazy rogue comments in there.
Correct.
It's a safe space.
Yeah, it's spot on. Yeah, because I think the internet can be a little bit of a rabbit hole, and I certainly found myself in preparation for a VBAC. I'll admit I was Googling things and on all sorts of random forums, and they were just they were doing more negative things to my mental health than anything, and I think it's nice to have a moderated space, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Hey mamas, Laura here. I really hope you got something out of that episode. I think I always have a slight vulnerability hangover after sharing anything personal, and a birth story is probably about one of the most personal things that you can share. So please do head over to my socials at PhysioLaura if you have any follow-up questions or if you want to chat with me. I always love to hear your feedback, and I'm always open to chatting. Now, in the last 2 episodes of this C-section birth series, we will be covering my second birth story, as well as a Q&A episode on breastfeeding after a C-section, the C-section shelf, scar recovery, and so much more. I'll catch you soon for episode 4 in this 5-part C-section birth series, where we'll jump straight into my second birth story. Until then, mamas, sending you wonderful pregnancy vibes, and enjoy the incredible journey that is pregnancy.